Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Electronic Monitoring, a Reassessment webinar sponsored by the National Juvenile Justice Network and the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. My name is Zoe Shine, and on behalf of the National Juvenile Justice Network, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few things about the software that we're using. First of all, when you enter the conference, please make sure you've enabled your audio. You have the option of joining the discussion via telephone or using your computer speakers and microphone. Generally, the best method is to call in using the phone number listed in your control panel, enter the access ID and the audio pin, which are also listed in your control panel. So that's something to do if you're logged in on your computer. If you have any trouble, go back and try with the phone. Sometimes you get better luck. So because we have so many people on the webinar, everyone is muted to ensure that we don't have distracting background noise. Later when we get to the question and answer section, if you raise your hand to be called on, digital hand, we can call on you and unmute you so that you can ask your question verbally. In the upper right-hand corner of your control panel, if you want to minimize this giant control panel during the presentation, click the orange arrow and the panel will be hidden. If you click on it again, it will expand to its full size. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it into either the questions or chat box to send it to the panelists. In the interest of time, most questions will likely be answered at the end of the presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, you can either click the little raise hand icon next to your name in the attendees tab, or type it into the chat or question boxes. And if you raise your hand, we'll unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. If you type it in the chat box, a staff member will read it to the panelists for them to answer. Second to finally, if we don't have time to get through all the questions, panelists have kindly agreed to provide written responses, so we can put you in touch and you can email with them if we don't get to your question. Finally, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the NJJN website in the next few days. So if you want to come back and look at anything, you will be able to. Okay, I will introduce now Melissa Goman, who's my colleague here at NJJN, who will introduce the webinar and our panelists.
Hey, welcome everybody. For those of you not familiar with the National Juvenile Justice Network, we lead a movement of state-based juvenile justice reform organizations and alumni of our Youth Justice Leadership Institute to fight for a fairer youth justice system that's appropriate for youth and their families. And we advocate for policies and practices that treat youth in trouble with the law with dignity and humanity to strengthen them, their families, and their communities. So I'm really happy to present our panelists today. We're going to hear from three panelists, and we're going to start with Josh and Abel. So I'm going to briefly go over their bios, and then we'll hear from them. So Josh is an advocate with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. He was born in Palmdale, California in 1995 and raised in Inglewood. As an infant, Josh says that he was raised by foster parents who later adopted him. And he drifted towards some negative influences as a teen and was incarcerated for several years with the Department of Juvenile Justice. He has, since his release, he's focused on pursuing a bachelor's in business administration and working as an advocate with ARC. And his son is one of the most important parts of his life and a major force helping to motivate him forward. Abel, who we will also hear from, is an advocate with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition as well, and he was born in Los Angeles in 1995. Abel was raised by a single mother with 3 brothers and 4 sisters in Highland Park. And Abel states that he was 12 years old when he committed his first offense and was ultimately sentenced to several years in the Department of Juvenile Justice. Since his release, Abel has secured a job at a local coffee shop and recently finished his 3rd year at Los Angeles Mission College. And he's working towards a degree in kinesiology and hopes to transfer to California State University Northridge to study physical therapy. So I'm going to ask questions to each young man in turn for them to talk about their experiences. Both Josh and Abel have experienced electronic monitoring and have generously agreed to share their stories with us to help us to really understand what it's like for young people that are on electronic monitoring. So Josh, I'm going to start with you. First, if there's anything I've left out you'd like to add about yourself, please feel free to do so. And then I want you to talk a little bit about whether the ankle monitoring experiences was something you thought it would be like, or were there ways in which it was different from what you expected?
Okay. You hit everything. You hit everything on point about my background and my past and everything. But as far as like knowing what the ankle monitor was going to be like, I didn't have any clue on how it was going to be. I didn't think it would be like as big as it was. I didn't really think that it would be uncomfortable and hard to go to sleep with it around my ankle and things and that nature. Like I just thought it was gonna be like a ankle monitor. I didn't expect to charge it every 2 times a day and everything. And I don't know. It's kind of crazy.
Right. And Abel, I'll ask you the same question too. If there's certainly if there's anything else you'd like to say about yourself, please do so. And then tell us if you thought that being on an ankle monitor, if this was what you thought it'd be like, or if there were ways that it was different from what you expected.
As for me, the ankle monitor, what I thought about, like, it was way worse experiencing it. Like, it hit things of my life that I didn't expect, even like the little things of like that come with freedom. That if the ankle monitor, how it affected me. So like, the thought was bad, but the experience was even way worse for me.
So in what ways, was it worse? For example, were there specific things that it interfered with? What was it difficult? What was difficult about it?
But like one thing is like going to school, like, because the ankle monitor you're expected to charge like every 12 hours. So if I go to school and I charge in the morning, and I'll be in school till nighttime and it dies on me, it'll make like a loud vibrating noise. So people will turn around and look at me like, what is that, Even with work, I couldn't wear shorts or things like that because, like, I didn't want people to see my ankle monitor, even the size of it. Like, I know it scared people away, so that's things that I interfere with. Even little things of being out, like even things of getting into the pool or the ocean, like things that the ankle monitor stopped me from doing.
Right. So you can't, my understanding is you can't get it wet, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So you couldn't do anything, I guess, involving going into a lake or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. And Josh, in terms of you, were there specific activities and things that the monitor interfered with?
Yeah. I'll say yesterday I had something embarrassing. Yesterday it was very hot, and I had to enroll my son in school. And I know I couldn't wear shorts because, me walking in there with like a big ankle monitor on would like, kind of like make me look a certain way as far as taking my son in there. And it kind of it would have made me embarrassed because like any other time I wore shorts with my ankle monitor on, it's like the center of attention. Like everybody want to know what it is and why I got to put it on and everything like that. And even my son asking me sometimes like, Daddy, what is it? And everything, and I have to explain to him like, in the most appropriate way. So, it has major down points.
Right. Have you ever gotten in trouble for any ankle monitor violations?
I have got like threats about, being if I don't charge that they'll tell my PO and ask for jail time and things like that, because before I had a car I have to travel back and forth from Gardena from the valley, and it's a long distance, and I don't get back home until nighttime, and my ankle monitor will die, so like I will get calls all the time basically telling them, hey, can you charge, or if you don't charge we'll have to tell your PO, and your PO will tell them if you can put jail time on it and everything. My PO did tell me like a couple of days ago, like they said if you miss a day one more time, then like they're gonna ask for jail time. So it's like a lot of threats that comes with not charging my ankle monitor.
Right, and it sounds like you have to be at home to charge it. Is that?
I can be, I need to be anywhere. I have to be anywhere and everything. It's like they just want me to charge it, but being having to travel, you know, on a bus and, you know, public transportation doesn't give me the chance to charge it and everything. So.
Right. And Abel, have you had any trouble, gotten any violations in terms of the ankle monitor? And if so, what were some of the things that caused that?
Yes, I actually had experience of I went back in for 5 days because I actually got into the ocean and fried the ankle monitor because I had gone to the beach and with one of my roommates and like they started kayaking and I never been kayaking. So I was like, damn, like I'm out, like I'm free, but it's like I'm not free because I can't do this right now. So I had made the choice like, man, I'm gonna have fun right now and try this. So I made the choice and actually got into the ocean and like, honestly, I didn't regret trying it and spending those 5 days in jail because like, I actually felt free for once with the ankle monitor. So yeah, I did have experience to go back into jail with it.
Right. And someone has asked how old each of you are. So how old are you, Abel?
I'm turning 21 next month on the 24th. I mean 21. Yeah.
Okay. And Josh, how old are you?
I'm 21.
21 also. Okay. So Josh, do you think being on the ankle monitor changed your relationship at all with your probation officer? And if so, how might it have changed it?
Well, I don't really feel like it changed that much because my appeal is a little bit lenient. I think by his judgment on whether I should have been put on was, you know, directed by someone else other than, and he like just had to, you know, go off of, you know, off his instincts. But as far as like our relationship, I don't think it's like he still wants me to get off probation. He's still trying to push for it, but he also does threaten sometimes, like, hey, if you mess up on the ankle monitor, keep messing up, then you'll go back to jail. So when you know I hear things like that, it's like, dang, I'm that close to going back to jail, like, and I'm not really doing anything that can really land me back in jail. You know, I'm doing everything, like, you know, as far as working, you know, take care of my son and things like that. So I don't know, it messes me up when somebody tells me I could be that close of going back to jail so soon.
Right. So someone has asked whether being on the monitor for you, Josh, was this an alternative to being locked up in a facility, or did it come afterwards?
It came afterwards. Yeah, it came afterwards.
Okay. And Abel, is that the same for you?
Yes, it came afterwards.
Okay. So, Abel, would you say were there times with the electronic monitor when it has felt similar to being locked up? And if so, could you describe that?
Honestly, when I was incarcerated, I knew I was incarcerated, so I knew how to adapt to it. But like being out here, like being free, but being on an ankle monitor, just like it makes you feel not free because there's certain things you can't do that people that are free do, you know. So like it limits you from your freedom. So like I came to the point where like that's why I got on the beach and said, man, you know what, I'm just gonna get in, you know, like I'm gonna have fun because I got to the point where it was like I want to be free, you know, mentally and physically. So I got to the point where I didn't really care no more.
Right. And I don't know if you've discussed this, but are there limitations in terms of leaving the house?
Yeah, I was actually stuck in my house for 3 months without going anywhere, just school and back to my house. And like experiencing that, me myself, like that added more pressure to me because like I got to a point where for the holidays I couldn't even go spend time with my family. That was my first holidays out, you know. So I got into the depression mode where like I just wanted to give up because the ankle monitor.
And then after those 3 months, have you still had limitations? Can you go where you want, or do you need permission, or how does that work?
Actually, I was on the ankle monitor for 7 months. And one thing about it is that my probation officer never told me when I was getting off of it. So that affected me also because like, damn, I feel like I was never getting off this ankle monitor. So like, that just kept me in that depression mode, like no faith in like the ankle monitor coming off. And like my probation, like as for like the question you asked Josh, like, did it make it like more confrontation with your probation officer? As for me, like, since I've been released, I already had like little miscommunication with my probation officer, but like having an ankle monitor just added more things. It added more difficultness to the situation because now she's asking me like, oh, why aren't you charging? Like, but it's hard for me to explain because like, oh, I go to school and I work. Like, how am I supposed to charge the hours you want me to work? Like, charge if I'm working or in school, you know? So it just made the situation more difficult for me.
Right. And I guess, Josh, the same thing for you. Or has the ankle monitor at all helped you sometimes feel like you were still locked up? And if so, you could describe that.
Yeah, I mean, like, if I was to give an example, it's like, you know, letting somebody cause I've been I was fighting for my freedom, like, you know, cause in YA it's like a struggle to get out, and as soon as I get out, like, somebody's telling me, okay, you can get out, but you can't do this, you can't do A, B, and Z, you know. So I got out, and as soon as they put the ankle monitor on, they was trying to tell me, like, you know, I have to go back from school back to the apartment, but I'm like, I have a son, so they gave me, like, my PO gave me like he gave me the lead to go get my son and come back to the apartments, but it's like, it's not just going there and coming back. It take at least 6 to 7 hours to come there, go there and come back with my son on the trains and the buses. So like, so yeah, it's.
And were you ever confined to your house like Abel was describing?
Yeah, they tried, but because I have a son and everything, and I you know, get them on the weekends and stuff like that. They couldn't let me get them and stuff like that.
Right. So do you, other than going the places you need to go with your son and your job, do you need permission to go any place else, or?
Just like out of because the GPS monitor loses signal when you go out of county. So if I was to go out of county, say it's my little brother's graduation, I have to ask my PO to go, and that's like probably like an hour away from LA. So yeah, I have to ask for permission.
So I'll ask each of you this. Josh, would you prefer 1 day incarcerated, or if you had a choice, 1 day incarcerated or 3 days on a monitor? What would be your preference? And then the same question, 1 month incarcerated versus 3 months on an ankle monitor.
I'll take 1 day, and I'll take 1 day and 3 months, because like, just 1 day, like, you could just be like, all right, you know what, I'm gonna go in, get this over with, and get out. But if you got 3 days, you out here, and then if you do anything, or if, you know, it's like a lot of confrontation when people see it. Like, everybody I like ran into that seen my ankle monitor wants to know what it is, and like, it's like, I know I did time for my crime and everything, you know, I'm trying to, you know, start a new chapter in my life, and I'm trying to get past that, but it's hard for me to get past that when, you know, people ask me, oh, why you got a GPS monitor on, and then why are you on probation, and why did you go to jail in the first place, and it just brings back that, you know, and I'm just trying to get past that and try to, you know, not be looked at as, you know, someone who made a mistake in his life, but someone who's trying to push and make and become something of himself, you know?
Right. Right.
So I would rather just take that day and get it over with, rather than, you know, have it on my ankle. It's like putting a mark on myself.
And Abel, what would your thoughts be if you could have 1 day incarcerated or 3 days on a monitor?
I will honestly say the 1 day incarcerated, because like if I take the 1 day incarcerated, it's like, let me get this over with, and I could come back and just start over with school and work. But if I was to have the 3 days on an ankle monitor, now I got to worry about, oh, how am I going to charge it for work? Or, oh, I got to go home, you know, I got to leave early because I got to go charge, and I'm going to have to hear from my probation officer. So I wouldn't want to have to go through all that, so I'd rather just take the day off so I could come out and start all over.
Right. I'm just looking to see if we have other questions from participants. So one person wanted to know, I think, why don't we start with Abel, wanted to know if they explained the conditions of the electronic monitor to you before it was placed on you, and did you understand what they were, you know, all the ramifications?
Well, they didn't tell me how long I was gonna be on it for, but for like what they expect. Like the only reason I got put on it was for me not to go to my mom's house. That's the reason I got the ankle monitor for. But then that I had a curfew. I had to I'll go to work at school. I had to be home by 6. They told me it was water resistant, and that's pretty much it. And that was kind of hard for me because not being able to see my family, all right, I go to school and work, I don't really care where else I go, I don't mind, I could stay home, but I want to see my family too, I was away 4 years from my family, so how do you expect me to stay away from my family, so that made it hard for me.
And did they tell you why they were putting an electronic monitor on you as opposed to any other options?
No. The reason why they put the ankle monitor on me is because they want to make sure that I wasn't going back to my mom's house, because being incarcerated, I was going to my mom's house and I came to an accident where some guys jumped me waiting for the bus. So my probation officer decided to put me in an ankle monitor to make sure I wasn't going to mom's house. But even after that, my mom had been moved out of the area for 4 months already, and I just got off the ankle monitor 2 months. So even though my mom had moved out the area, I still had the ankle monitor for 2 extra months.
Okay. And Josh, did they explain to you all the circumstances of the electronic monitor, what it would be like, and why they were making you wear that as opposed to any other alternative?
Yeah, well, what was explained to me was that, you have to charge twice a day, we could see where you are and everything, but I don't really recall them telling me that I couldn't, get into the ocean or, basically, how can I say it, John a device. I didn't know I couldn't get into the ocean and everything, and I didn't fry my device, but I kind of, messed up the signal by getting in the ocean, but, yeah, I didn't, they just basically, the basic things they went over was just charge it twice a day and, make sure you don't go out of county.
And did they say why they were having you go on the electronic monitor as opposed to any other kind of option?
Yeah, it was, it was something that happened, and, it wasn't, I say it wasn't as serious as it was, it happened what, almost eight months ago, and I'm still on the device, and it was it wasn't serious. It wasn't, I shouldn't have been put on a GPS monitor for what happened.
Do you know why they put you on the GPS monitor? Or it just seemed routine?
Yeah.
Or?
Yes. I know why they put me on a GPS monitor. It was family issues, and yeah.
Okay.
But I was never told how long I was gonna be on for, and now it's going on 8 months, and I've been doing everything I was supposed to as far as the groups and and things in that matter, and I still don't have it all.
So I really want to give Kate a chance to talk. We have a lot more questions. So if we are able to, Josh and Abel will get to them at the end, but I want to really thank you. I appreciate your coming on and sharing your experiences. I think it's really helpful for people to learn, and I know they're really interested in it. So thank you very much. And I think now we're going to move on to Kate Weisburd. So Kate, just want to make sure you're there.
I am, thank you.
Great. So I'm sorry, if you don't mind, Kate, could you tell folks a little bit about your background? Or wait, I'm sorry. Here, I have the information. So Kate directs the Youth Defender Clinic at East Bay Community Law Center, and that's affiliated with UC Berkeley Law School. And the clinic represents youth in delinquency, school discipline, and special education proceedings in Alameda County, California. And Kate has researched issues related to criminal and juvenile justice, and specifically have published many articles, but one specifically on monitoring youth, which we can send a link to folks to afterwards. It has some very interesting research and analysis in it, and Kate's going to talk more about electronic monitoring, and you can take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me just go to my first slide if I can. Oop, I'm not able to get to my next slide. There we go. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm so grateful that this conversation is happening. I think that both Abel and Josh said so perfectly, I think, some of the many questions that I have about electronic monitoring they raised. And so what I want to talk about today briefly is, what we see right now undeniably is growing bipartisan support to find more effective and cheaper alternatives to incarceration. And electronic monitoring is often touted as a great alternative. And it makes intuitive sense, I think, to policymakers who've never been on a monitor, that electronic monitoring is kind of the best of both worlds. It allows for monitoring while decreasing reliance on prison. It's kind of jail to go. As one reporter once observed, quote, "Even accepting a certain failure rate by nearly any measure, such prisons without bars would represent a giant step forward for justice, criminal rehabilitation, and society." But the question that has not been sufficiently asked and certainly not answered is whether electronic monitoring is actually working in juvenile court. Does electronic monitoring work with young people? Does it reduce recidivism? Is it in fact cheaper than jail? And most importantly, does it in fact rehabilitate young people, which is the stated purpose of the juvenile court system? Alternatively, are we simply, and I think that both Abel and Josh's comments really illustrate this, are we simply trading one burden for another? Are we replacing one form of incarceration with another equally troubling form of incarceration? Are we now in a place where we're replacing mass incarceration with mass surveillance, and we're replacing the prison industrial complex with the surveillance industrial complex? So today, I'd like to share some of my thoughts about electronic monitoring, but the true experts are truly Josh and Abel and the other young people who themselves have been on electronic monitoring. Fortunately, and not surprisingly, there's a deep disconnect between the policymakers who tout electronic monitoring and the young people who actually have direct and lived experiences on electronic monitoring. Sometimes I hope or wish that policymakers could themselves live on an electronic monitor and have to follow those rules so they could see what it's like to actually be on a monitor. And if there's one thing that I hope you take away from my comments today, is that now is the time to push policymakers to question electronic monitoring and to better understand the many ways that it can cause much more harm than good. So I hope that today is just part of a much bigger discussion. I want to start by telling you about one of my clients. And if I can just go to the next slide. There we go. So this is Joe. That's not his real name, but that is a picture of Joe. And when I represented Joe, he was 16. He lived in a small apartment with his mom and 2 siblings. He admitted to shoplifting 2 pairs of sneakers. It was his second arrest. And he was placed on juvenile probation and had to abide by almost 24 probation conditions. Additionally, as a condition of his probation, he was also ordered to wear a GPS device on his ankle. And that came with an additional 24 rules. And those rules included, and you heard Abel and Josh talk about these earlier, charging the device every night from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m., that he remain in his house except if attending school, that any other movement outside of his house, such as going to work, to church, or the grocery store, had to be approved at least 48 hours in advance by his PO. Joe was also told that he had to call the electronic monitoring office at least 3 times a day. And this was really hard on Joe and hard on his mother. His mother was a single working mom struggling to support her kids. She was billed $15 a day by Alameda County for the device. She had to pay for a new cell phone for Joe so he could be compliant. And she tried to plan their lives 48 hours in advance and aimed to be home every day at 7 p.m. on the dot so that Joe could charge the device. But staying inside their small apartment every day, all day long, especially on days when there was no school, was almost impossible for Joe. And on 2 separate nights, he stayed out past 7. Once while he was walking his dog, and another time when he was talking to kids in his apartment complex. The next time Joe was in court, the judge placed him in custody for 3 days for a monitoring violation. And in the end, Joe was in the juvenile justice system for 1.5 years. During that time, he spent a total of 7 months on an electronic monitor and was incarcerated 10 different times, either for a monitoring or probation violation, and never a new offense. In total, he was detained in juvenile hall for 3.5 months, including Christmas and his birthday. And I just want to show you, these are the rules. If we can go to the next slide. These are the rules that Joe had to abide by. You can see there are many of them, and I'll go into greater detail. These are the electronic monitoring rules, and on top of them are the probation rules that Joe had to abide by. And these rules are really hard to comply with. Some of them are very specific, like the exact time to charge the device, and others have give a lot of room for discretion to the probation officer, such as, obey your parents and be of good conduct. And what happened to Joe is not unique. What we see is that there's a vicious cycle with electronic monitoring, that young people are put on monitors, they're then found to be in violation of the monitoring program, they're rearrested, jailed, and then released again on electronic monitoring. When I did an informal survey of public defenders across the country, the majority reported that most of their clients were arrested at least 1 or 2 times for violations of electronic monitoring. And again, these violations ranged from failing to obey a parent, staying out past curfew, failing to charge the device, or cutting off the device altogether. So what do we know about electronic monitoring? We know that it is everywhere. Joe's story is not unique. Abel's experience I don't think is unique based on my experience, nor is Josh's. Last year, we started working with the Samuelson Law, Technology, and Public Policy Clinic at UC Berkeley to examine the use of electronic monitoring here in California. And law students surveyed all California counties. They collected a lot of the terms and conditions, and I'm going to share those with you so you can really see what these rules are that govern electronic monitoring. But what we do know is that around 85% of California counties use electronic monitoring in juvenile court. In LA County, for example, on any given day, there's between 450 to 500 youth on monitors. And all but 2 states allow for electronic monitoring in the juvenile justice system. So this is quite a widespread phenomenon. What do we know about electronic monitoring? We know that for the most part, the programs involve some form of house arrest. So youth are ordered to remain in their house at all times. In our county, they're told that they, going out on the porch, going into the garage, going out into the backyard, that would technically be a violation, and sometimes our clients are violated for that. Most electronic monitoring programs have lots and lots and lots of rules. Most often, electronic monitoring is used as a condition of pretrial release or as a condition of probation. So it's often attached, as you heard with Josh and Abel, at the end of either some time in juvenile hall, or in the case of Joe, he was never actually incarcerated for the shoplifting. He was just placed straight on juvenile probation, but as one of the conditions was to be on a monitor. Electronic monitoring also disproportionately impacts Black and Latino youth. For these young people who are already over-policed and already over-represented in the juvenile justice system, electronic monitoring adds to what sociologist Victor Rios calls the youth control complex, which is a system of constant surveillance. And the more rules, the more opportunity police have and probation officers have of finding violations. In Alameda County, we know from the most recent statistics, which are now a few years old, but still that Black and Latino youth are routinely on electronic monitoring for much longer than their white counterparts. And finally, most counties in California do charge fees for young people to be on a monitor. So that's what we know. But what we don't know is, does electronic monitoring actually work? And we don't know the answer to that. There is no reliable empirical evidence suggesting that electronic monitoring works with young people. For all the talk of evidence-based practices, there is simply no evidence that electronic monitoring is accomplishing the stated goals of rehabilitation. And we really need to push for a public conversation about whether it works and whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And this conversation must include the voices of young people who've been on monitoring as well as empirical research. You know, stats and data is really useful and very critical, but so too are the voices of young people who are impacted. Voices that are frankly not listened to when thinking about what alternatives to incarceration make sense. So while electronic monitoring is intuitively appealing, I mean, it's easy to say, well, being out of jail is always better than being in. Its appeal, the appeal of electronic monitoring, depends on these widely disseminated but wholly untested assumptions. And I think there are 5 assumptions about electronic monitoring's effectiveness. 1 is that it's better than jail. 2 is that it lowers incarceration rates. 3 is that it works well with young people. 4 is that it works well with families. And 5, that it's cheaper than prison. So I'm going to share with you some of the rules that the Samuelson Clinic collected to demonstrate the ways in which I think that there are lots of questions about whether these assumptions are in fact true. So let's look at those rules. So assumption 1 is that electronic monitoring is better than jail. Quite frankly, I think Abel and Josh gave such a compelling answer to this that I don't have much to add other than to support what they said with some of the rules that govern. So here we have, you can see, this is just an example of one of the rules: remain within the interior of my residence at all times. I will only leave when authorized to do so. Young people in this county have to provide documentation for all authorized leaves of absences from my residence upon request. And again, these are excerpts from electronic monitoring rules throughout California, so this isn't just Alameda County. The minor may not visit friends at their homes, allow friends to visit his or her home at any time, nor meet friends at any other location. All requests for passes must be made, you can see here, by noon on the Thursday before the event is happening. And so what you can see is that this is very oppressive and it's very hard. Not only does a monitor act as a scarlet letter for young people who have them, but it's dehumanizing. It's like being being a caged animal or being on a leash. And so there are real dignity questions raised by electronic monitoring, and it's not as simple as a quid pro quo of 1 day in jail versus 1 day on electronic monitoring. As you heard Josh and Abel explain, it's much more complicated than that, and the reality is that it's never just a one-for-one exchange. Most young people are on electronic monitoring for much longer than they would have otherwise been in jail. So is that assumption correct? Not necessarily. The second assumption is that it lowers incarceration rates. There too, I think that there are reasons to think that that's not in fact true. What we see is that more kids are arrested on probation violations and detained longer. And so it's net widening. Young people who wouldn't otherwise be detained are being placed on electronic monitoring as a condition of probation. So for example, young people in truancy court or who have low-level misdemeanors are placed on electronic monitoring. So yes, in theory, they could be detained, but in practice, these young people are usually not detained. And what we see with this net widening is sort of judges thinking, well, if we have it, we may as well use it mentality with respect to GPS. It's also net deepening, so young people are staying in the system longer. They stay on electronic monitoring longer. And one violation of the GPS contract means staying longer on probation. And you heard Josh and Abel talk about one of the most frustrating things about juvenile court is there's often indefinite sentencing. So young people often stay on probation or stay on electronic monitoring until a court determines they're rehabilitated. That's really hard for young people, I think, well, really for anyone, to feel like there's this unknown of how long they'll be on the monitor. And then finally, I think there's a revolving door problem. So like with Joe, young people on electronic monitoring are going in and out of juvenile hall at a much higher frequency than young people who are not on electronic monitoring. I mean, that's at least a question, and there's no data to suggest that that's not necessarily true. So, and I think it begs the question, are courts and probation officers more concerned with sort of technical compliance than the overall well-being of a young person? the story of going kayaking and then being put in jail for 5 days is a perfect example where, there's no risk to society by kayaking. There's no danger, and yet it was technically a violation of the electronic monitoring program. So I think that that's a really good example of the revolving door. So that assumption, I don't think that's necessarily true, and we certainly don't have data on it. This, I think here too, whether electronic monitoring actually works well with young people, I want to share with you some of the rules that we found to demonstrate, I think, some of why this is so hard for young people. And I say young people, but honestly, this would be hard for anyone. It would be hard for me. It would be hard for anyone to abide by these rules. So here are some of them, common ones. Stay inside the home at all times. The minor may not participate in any extracurricular school activities or sports. If your electronic monitoring goes dead, you're subject to arrest. Call the electronic monitoring office every time you go anywhere. Work schedules may only be changed with the approval of the probation officer. The minor is not allowed to be employed during the term of his or her detention on electronic monitoring. Charge your device every day from 7 to 9. I will not change my means of transportation without prior approval of staff. No visitors in the home unless pre-approved by the PO. And this one I really love, especially for teenagers. I agree to keep my residence maintained in a clean and sanitary manner. Failure to keep my residence clean and sanitary could result in my removal from the program. So are these rules realistic for anyone, much less young people? What we know about adolescent development suggests that this is actually a really poor fit with young people's brains. Young people are not great at planning in advance. No young person is. That's part of that's actually normal from a development perspective. Youth are impulsive. They respond to peer pressure. And youth need pro-social activities. They need to be around other young people. They need to be around family. And isolating youth in their homes does more harm than good. So it's also not clear that the young people, certainly that I've worked with, truly understand, much less remember all these rules. And again, I don't think anyone would truly understand or remember all these rules. I think the other issue here is that we assume that kids react to deterrence, that sort of all these rules have a deterrence effect, but research shows that deterrence actually doesn't work with young people. So really quickly, the last two assumptions that I want to address is how electronic monitoring impacts families, not just the young people who are on them. So here are some rules that I think really do impact families pretty dramatically. All requests for passes must be made by the parents or guardians 48 hours in advance. I agree I am not allowed to have any visitors at any time. The exception is immediate family, no aunts, uncles, or cousins. Transportation to and from school must be provided by my parent or guardian. I understand that I must be under the immediate supervision of my parents or guardian, except as authorized by probation officers to be at a scheduled activity such as school, counseling, or employment. So there's a lot to, one more is no individual may join the household without prior approval. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to be brief so that we can get to some questions. But I think one of the problems here is that this assumes that there's a sort of one-size-fits-all family with resources. But of course we know that life isn't like that. Families have, especially families with young people who are in the juvenile court system, have a lot of other things happening, a lot of pressures, a lot of challenges, and complying with these rules is incredibly, incredibly hard. And it also assumes a sort of traditional home as well, which of course isn't always the case. I've certainly worked with young people who've talked about how being on the monitor feels like solitary confinement because their parents or their guardians or family members work odd hours, and so the young people we work with sometimes are just home for hours and hours and hours on end with no one home, and they can't leave, and so it feels like solitary confinement. On the other end of the spectrum, we've also worked with young people who live in in a studio with many family members where sometimes tensions run high, and it's really hard for the young person to not be able to go outside to get some air. But of course, these rules don't allow for that type of flexibility. Finally is the assumption that electronic monitoring is actually cheaper than jail. And I think the big question here is cheaper for who? Much like other aspects of the criminal justice system, there is a privatized aspect to electronic monitoring. And it is defendant funded. So people who are in the juvenile court system and their families foot the bill. So roughly 50% of California counties charge families a daily usage fee of between $7 and $24. If a young person cuts off the device or the device is damaged, that's an additional hundreds if not thousands of dollars for replacement. There's the cost of the cell phone. And for most young people and their families in the juvenile court system, what this means is pushing poor families further into poverty. For counties, it does save them money because there's a cost shifting mechanism here where families foot the bills, and so counties are saved money. So yes, it's cheaper for counties, but not for the young people we work with or their families. And I think it's also really important to remember the profit motive here as well. You can see in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, that's actually from the website of Satellite Tracking of People, also known as STOP, which is the provider of electronic monitoring here in Alameda County. You can see in the upper right that there's a button for, quote, offender payment. And this is really big business. These are all private companies. Some of them, like the Geo Group, is a several billion-dollar industry, publicly traded companies. And of course, there's a profit motive here because the more people who are on monitors for longer, the richer these companies get. So that assumption, too, is it cheaper than incarceration? Not necessarily. So I'm going to end there, and I'd be happy to answer questions. There's a lot more to say, but I'll stop for right now.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. So we have a few questions that were written in. One has to do with the assumptions. Greg wanted to know whose assumptions were these and if it's from a survey and who was the survey given to.
Yeah, so the assumptions that I'm referring to are the sort of policy justifications that are often touted as the rationale for using electronic monitoring. So when you read in the newspaper about how great electronic monitoring is, these 5 assumptions are often what are seen as the justifications for electronic monitoring. And what I'm trying to say is we don't have any empirical evidence to suggest that those assumptions are in fact correct.
Okay. Someone else wanted to know where you were getting your data.
So from a few different places. There's not a ton of data. And so the first thing to say is I wish I was getting my data from someplace because there's so little data. And I really think that given how often electronic monitoring is used, it's appalling that we don't have better data. But where I've gotten my data from is I did an informal survey of public defenders, which I totally concede is not at all official or, great research. It was just the best I could do given how little information is out there. And then the Samuelson Clinic here at Berkeley Law School did a survey of all the California counties to look at the actual terms. So all of those excerpts that I had, those rules, those came from counties throughout California through Public Record Act requests. We got those.
Okay, great. Someone wanted to know, let's see, what the actual percentage of youth violating their probation by not charging their monitor was, if you know that.
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that question because that's an excellent question, and that's exactly the problem is we don't know the answer to that. So, I mean, if we know that in the adult system, a huge percentage of adults are confined in jails for probation violations. I think it's some 40 or 50%. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we would see similar numbers in the juvenile court system, but there's no data tracking that, which I think is a huge problem.
Okay. This I think you answered, but the question from Lillian is, have you found assumption 5 in other states than California? It sounds like you were just looking at California, is that right?
We have right now, our policy clinic here at the law school has been doing a ton of research into the fees with respect to juvenile court, and so that's where I got some of the information with respect to the fees on families. I know that the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia is doing more research with respect to fees in general, but I don't know beyond California much about the fees for electronic monitoring. I do know it's pretty common to charge the people who are wearing the devices for wearing them.
Okay. Joanne wants to know if you know of anyone who might be conducting research on some of the questions that you've raised.
Other than the clinics that I've mentioned here at the law school, I don't know of anyone conducting empirical research, and I wish my answer was yes, I know of many, but I think that's the problem, is I don't think it's being researched enough.
Okay. Okay, someone wanted to know if a family cannot afford the daily fee for the device, is there an alternative?
It varies tremendously by counties and between the adult system and the juvenile system. In the adult system, the alternative is jail. So in the adult system here in Alameda County, if you can't afford to be released on a monitor, you just stay in jail. In the juvenile system, here in Alameda County, thanks in large part to the work of one of our clinics here, there is no more fee for electronic monitoring, which is great. So when I represented Joe, there was. Now there isn't. Ideally, it should be waivable, but it varies by county as to whether it's waivable or not. In some counties, I think, but I can't confirm this, that if a young person can't afford the costs, that the alternative would be jail. They just wouldn't be allowed to participate in the program.
Okay. Anna wanted to know which are the 2 states that do not use electronic monitoring and use.
I believe it is, oh, I misspoke. It's only 1. New Hampshire does not provide for electronic monitoring. Now this is just what I don't know, these are all the states except New Hampshire provide for, have laws about electronic monitoring. That doesn't necessarily mean they're doing it, but they do have laws that allow for it.
Okay. There seems to be questions around, how much the money aspect is impacting it. So, for example, one question is, what is your view if the money is strictly paid by the county? Does the monitoring work then?
Well, it's interesting. I think in San Francisco, families are not billed, and fewer and fewer less young people are put on monitoring. So I don't know if that's a correlation or a causation, but you can't help but wonder if what's happening there is because the county's footing the bill, they're more judicious in who they place on a monitor.
Okay.
But again, there's no data tracking that, so I wish there were, because I think that's a great question that we should have an answer to.
Right. And I think a lot of questions have pointed to, both for you and for Josh and Abel, isn't electronic monitoring better than being incarcerated? And from reading your article, and also I think you briefly touched on this in the PowerPoint, it seems like the problem is that, and correct me if this isn't right, that it's not being used enough as an alternative, but it's in addition to incarceration. So it's not cutting time, but it's expanding, the limitations of freedom. Is that basically what's happening in most places, or?
Yes. Go ahead.
This is Josh. I would say it actually expands it because, if you can't get off the GPS monitor, you can't get off probation, so it just keeps on going. So. And
was your time in jail reduced at all by virtue of being let out in an electronic monitor, or did that not impact it at all?
Yeah, my time was reduced, but I wasn't on the GPS monitor. But when I got out here, it's like no reducing the GPS monitor. It's like if you do this, you can't do anything earlier on and get the GPS monitor taken off. But from my experience, I haven't got any. I got time added.
So okay, so that was Josh, right? And Abel, did you get out any earlier in exchange for going on the electronic monitor?
So, well, I got out earlier for the facility, but I got put on the ankle monitor out here, but they never told me when I was getting off the ankle monitor. I was on the ankle monitor for 8 months. I never knew when I was going to get off.
Okay.
And I'll just add, that I think one of the, this is one of those, it makes intuitive sense that being on a monitor is better than being in jail, but just like Abel and Josh have said, that's just, it's not as simple as that. It's often added on in addition to being detained. For the young person I worked with, for Joe, for example, he was never going to be jailed for shoplifting. The GPS was just added on as a condition. And in fact, he spent more time in jail because of GPS, because of all the violations. He ended up spending a month and a half in jail. Also, I think that when you say, like, is it being on a monitor better than being in custody, that assumes a 1-to-1 ratio of 1 day in custody and 1 day on a monitor. But of course, we know now that that's not exactly what happened.
Right. Do you, any of you have suggestions for alternatives to either detention or electronic monitoring?
I'll defer to Abel and Josh before I offer my thought.
No.
I mean, one alternative I can think of would be regular check-ins with your probation officer. I mean, I think that's commonly what was done before electronic monitoring. Do you think that would have been effective? I mean, some people have, some of the questions have been, you know, whether, as much as you don't like electronic monitoring, did you find it was beneficial to helping you, you know, stay on track and keep from getting into trouble? Or so, what do you guys? How would you guys answer that?
Well, I think everything I was doing before I was on got put on GPS monitor, I still was doing because I was in school, you know, take care of my son, and when they put me on the GPS monitor, it just gave me like a time limit, just made everything a little more like compact, like, all right, I got to do this, I got to charge my GPS monitor, I got to go get my son and, you know, do this. Like I don't think it was beneficial at all. It's just like.
Oh.
And can I just, I couldn't agree with, I mean, I think the alternative is no GPS, quite frankly, because it isn't beneficial and it does make the lives of the young people who are on it that much harder. I mean, in the ideal world, there would be no GPS, and there would be, I think, more funding for community-based programs where young people can get, you know, job training, get jobs, you know, have support not from probation officers necessarily, but from counselors, from program specialists who whose job it is to support young people, like more robust after-school programs. There's so many other ways that we could invest in young people and invest in the community, in their communities, and that keeps young people in their communities instead of investing in, you know, I think what is essentially an extension of the prison system.
Thanks, Kate. I'm just saying we're at 3 o'clock. I feel like we could go another hour. We have lots of questions, but I will tell folks that didn't get their questions answered that the panelists have agreed to answer additional questions, so we'll send them those questions and try to get a response to you. And this webinar has been recorded, and we will put up a link so you can listen to it, or you know, it'll be available for others that you think might be interested that weren't able to phone in. But I really want to thank Josh and Abel and Kate. We really appreciate your time and the effort you put into your presentations. I think it was really very helpful, and I hope we'll hear from all of you again. So thank you so much, and thank you to all our listeners for phoning in and being part of this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.